Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I have a chilling collection of paranormal stories for you to enjoy. And have you ever wondered how much of your personal information is floating around on the internet? Go ahead, do a quick search of your name and see what comes up. Scary, isn't it? To know your private info is out there for sale to the highest bidder? Data brokers sell your info to scammers, your full name, email, even your health records. But even in the darkest corners of the web, there is some hope. A sanctuary amongst the chaos called Aurora, the sponsor of today's video, which shows me which data brokers sell my information and automatically submit opt-out requests for me. Cleaning up my information not only reduces the amount of spam I get, but protects me from hackers who could use the info to access my social media accounts, bank accounts, and other sensitive information. Did you hear about the AT&T breach with over 73 million records being released? Scary, isn't it? They recommend strong passwords, but Aurora does more, and for less. No need for multiple apps. With Aurora you get comprehensive protection at a fraction of the cost, and if your information was compromised at the AT&T data breach, you can rest easy knowing that Aurora is always on your side. I value my privacy, and yours, so follow the link on screen or in the description to start your 2-week free trial. Your data deserves to be protected. I'm a first responder, and I've seen some crap. So I'm pretty cynical when it comes to most claims and I naturally try to debunk them. However, I don't have an explanation for what happened that day to myself and my wife when we picked up a free piece of furniture from Middlefield, Connecticut. We had just gotten around to renovating our guest bedroom, but we weren't super rich or anything, so I had been stalking down items on Facebook Marketplace that fit the bill and budget. We were almost there, and had set up a new bed frame a week before and needed a side table to go with the bed. We contacted a lady who had a rather beautiful and ornate wood side table that she had listed for free. That should have been a red flag to begin with, but it's not unheard of where people just want something gone. Contrary to any other items we'd pick up, she said she'd left the table outside for us to collect, but again, it's understandable that some people don't want or need to meet the people picking up their stuff. We drove over to Middlefield in our SUV to collect it. When we got there, we found it on the side of the road, alongside a children's paddle pool that had seen better days. It was full of scuzz and feathers. Both items were outside of the address, a house with all the curtains pulled in the middle of the day. That too struck me as odd, but again, you never know someone's circumstance, so I tried not to ponder on it for too long. I put it all in the back and began to drive back home, and partway through the drive our SUV began to act up. The warning flashes were randomly going off, and my dashboard kept alerting me to a passenger in the back seat without a seatbelt on. The problem was there was no one in the back seat. Confused, I told my wife we'd have to take the SUV to get seen to by her uncle who's a mechanic if the random faults didn't stop. The radio turned to static at one point and skipped through the channels, another thing the car had never done before. We finally made it home, put the new side table in the guest bedroom, and went about our day, finally settling to watch a movie on the television as night fell. At this point, our talking fire alarm decides to go nuts. The alarm was making a specific noise when it has been genuinely triggered by smoke or CO2, or when it's getting low on battery. So, I was rather confused when I realized it was malfunctioning and beeping, and speaking in garbled sentences. I sighed and managed to get it to silence before simply hoping it wouldn't do it again. Alas, it did. Several times throughout the night, and I turned on the central air, wondering if the change in early summer heat had gotten to it. By this time it was half midnight, and I just wanted to sleep. I was just drifting off when I heard a loud, distinct knocking coming from the spare bedroom, which is next door to myself and my wife's room. 3 times, and very insistent tapping noise. The spare bedroom is at the front of the house, so I was concerned someone was tapping on the front door or windows. I got my weapon and quietly approached the front of the house, finding nothing. I threw open the door of the spare room, half expecting to see someone illuminated in the window by the streetlight, but there was nothing. I checked under the bed and in the closet, then proceeded to clear the rest of my house and yard. I checked all the doors and windows for good measure, and then told my wife I had no idea. She asked me to go and knock on things in the spare room to see if we could see what made the loud noise, as it had been pretty loud. I did as she asked. She called from our bedroom that it wasn't the doors or windows or the closet. Then I tapped on the bed frame and she shouted back. That was it was exactly that. Weirded out a little, I came to the conclusion that it must have been the change in temperature and settling of the new furniture. I went to bed slightly unsettled now. It took no more than 5 minutes of us nestling back down before we heard creaking on the living room floorboards. I sat bolt upright, staring at the door to our bedroom. My wife was frozen beside me, and to my horror, the door handle began to turn. I watched it, unmistakable. Poised to leap from the bed, my eyes were wide in the dark as the door clicked open, and a little crack of light revealed nothing. I ran over the spot behind the door, yelling in my best first responder voice that I was armed, but I got no reply. I heard no breathing or movement. Eventually I flung the door open and proceeded to clear the house again, including the basement, but wound up with nothing different than before. As I walked back to the bedroom to tell my wife there was nothing again, the fire alarm went off right above my head. I'm not ashamed to say the sudden loudness had me diving to the floor. The alarm stuttered, detect, smoke, evacuate. Now highly pissed off, I moved a piece of furniture to reach it and pull it down. Considered deactivating it, safe in knowing that we had at least 6 in the house and 2 in close proximity. We are Catholic, and my wife began to pray out loud, clearly disturbed. The damn thing started to go off in my hand again, and I threw it down, startled again. Just when the closed bedroom door swung open, in a weird, stiff jerking fashion, nothing like it usually would. I stared at it, unable to process what was happening. I was used to fighting bad guys, I knew the protocols, but never something I couldn't see. My wife begged to call my mum, who is more spiritually inclined, and tell her what was happening. We did, and my mum almost immediately asked if we'd bought anything new to the house lately. We looked at one another, and then at the spare room. The issues with the car, the creepy scratches and wax on the surface of the table jumped into my head, and I said out loud, "I'm taking the table out of here." As soon as I said that, the alarm on the floor started blaring again, so I grabbed it and deactivated it entirely. Then I stormed into the spare room, grabbed the table, and took it out through the front door towards the road. There was a front compartment on the table which inexplicably flew open viciously and crushed my knuckles as I carried it to the front porch. It sat out on the curb for just over a day before it disappeared. I don't know who took it, but we left it for trash day. Nothing else unusual happened that night, and it's been quiet and peaceful ever since. I did end up saying a lot of Hail Marys and a lot of holy water and oil was used to bless the house after the fact though. Perhaps all of these things were a big coincidence, and on some level I'm still trying to tell myself they were. But I hope whoever took that table from the side of the road fares better than we did. When I was a child in the early 90s, my family was poorish, lower middle class most definitely. As a young boy around 5, my mother would frequently crack the window to cool my bedroom at night, or at least make it breathable. Frequently throughout my childhood, I would hear tapping at my window, and it would wake me up. I would lay there still, pretending to be asleep. I'd hear a voice say my name over and over, and it would be my mother's voice, asking, almost begging me to open the window so she could get inside. I would never do so, but I listened. "Ryan, come on, it's dark. Open the window so I can get inside." There was one occasion as a child where my mum locked herself outside. I was inside, and she asked me to open the window, and she simply slid the screen off, but that was during the day, maybe at around 2 p.m. That one occasion seeped into my mind as I heard my mother's voice plead with me to open the window in the dead of night so she could get back inside, but I just lay there. Guilt would sometimes take over, but I would still just lay there. The voice would go from begging to angry, telling me I'd be in trouble when she finally got inside and if I didn't open the window, but I would never budge. As I grew older, the tapping and voices persisted. Sometimes the voices would change and become that of my friends in the neighborhood. As I grew older, I began interacting with the voice, telling it I knew it wasn't my mum, or I know you're not Andrew, and I never knew what was begging me to come inside. As I entered elementary school, my parents had central air installed, and opening the window became a thing of the past, as did the voices, or so I thought. When I was in 3rd grade in '99, I was playing in my room and there was a tap on the window. It was my mum. She told me, "Come here and look at this." It was 4:30 in the afternoon. I had just returned from school not long before and thought nothing of it. And as I began to head outside, I walked through the living room. But my mum was in the kitchen. I approached her and began talking to her, and started to walk outside and hung around the doorway waiting for her. She seemed preoccupied with something in the kitchen, and I asked her what she wanted to show me. She had zero clue what I was talking about. I was going to argue, but then decided not to. Nothing else like that happened for a very long time. No voices, nothing. In 2010, when I was 19, my mother passed away. I still lived at home and it was just my dad and I. I was in my backyard mowing one day, and as I was releasing the bar, letting the motor shut off, I heard my mother's voice shout my name. I got a chill down my spine. It was as clear as day, but it felt like it was from within the yard. I told my dad. He simply attributed it to being my mother's spirit, checking on me from the other side, and that I shouldn't be afraid to interact. I nodded, and simply moved on. It's now 2024, 14 years after my mother's passing. My mum and dad both shared a birthday in April within days of each other. On the weekend of my mum's birthday, I went home to visit my dad for both of their birthdays. He wasn't there when I arrived to his house. He was at the cemetery, placing flowers. I called him on his cell, and he told me that he would be home soon. I decided to wait. I had my dog with me, who really liked my dad and was familiar with his house, but she didn't want to be there. I opened the side gate to get into my dad's fenced-in yard, and she didn't want to follow. I tried to coax her by taking off her harness, and she just sat. As I looked down at her, plain as day, I heard my mother's voice call my name again. I had immediate goosebumps and looked down at my dog, whose ears were perked as she glanced into the yard. I walked back to my car and waited for my dad and told him nothing. I worked at a bar that had a reputation for being haunted. While I wouldn't say for sure that it was, I completely understand why people believed it. After spending a year cleaning up every night after closing, I experienced some strange occurrences. Weird things would happen all the time. The lights would turn on and off by themselves, and bar stools wouldn't just fall off tables, they'd move a good 5 to 10 feet across the room. This bar was large, with multiple rooms, and sometimes I'd see a shadowy figure walk by in a dark room while I was cleaning up in a lit one. I'd turn on all the lights and search for the person who thought it was a brilliant idea to hide in the bar and drink all night for free, but I'd never find anyone. Maybe the place was haunted, or maybe it was just an old, creepy building where strange stuff happened regularly. It was always just enough to startle me and make me think, what the heck? There were no floating specters trying to process me or anything dramatic like that. Just more work for me, as I had to deal with stools being thrown around the place. My dad grew up in India, and his best friend was a cautious boy. The reason for this is because his parents consulted a seer to know their fate. The boy was told that he was destined to die young by cause of water, and that this fate was bound to his soul. In an attempt to circumvent this, The boy's parents had his name changed and ordered him to stay away from any form of water. They thought that this had ultimately changed his soul, as names were a pretty big deal in Hinduism. My dad and him had big plans then to leave India during college for greener pastures. They left for Germany and later the United States, however. Midway through college, my dad's friend had to return to India for a family gathering. My dad proceeded to America alone and had a family. He then had a business trip back to India and thought to visit his old friend. He went back and searched for him, and the elder in the town said he had died 20 years ago at the age of 22. The cause of death? Drowning, trying to save a child caught in a flood. The child survived, so his sacrifice at least wasn't in vain. I can't explain how the seer saw this or even knew this. The seer saw this boy would die young and by water, both of which were correct. I want to believe it's merely a coincidence, but there's way more stories like this my parents have. People say it's just coincidence, but story after story, I begin to wonder, could the old religions have been onto something? My father was a journalist in 1980, and I was around 2 to 3 years old. He was a hard-working and honest man with a lot of good friends. At 2 a.m, we received a call on our big black landline phone. It was his friend who had gotten in an accident on the highway. He said he was calling from a 24-hour STD booth near the site. The friend also asked him to bring a big, white bedsheet for him. At the time there were no mobile phones, so my father set out alone in a jeep and took a water bottle with the bedsheet. My parents were wondering what the bedsheet was for. My father reached the site, but there were no streetlights and he couldn't find his friend or scooter. He couldn't find the booth either, so he travelled for 5 more kilometers and found a police station. He contacted the cops there and told them the story. The cops took big torches and went with him to search for his friend. Finally, they found the scooter slid down on the side of the highway, with the middle part of his body cleanly slit down horizontally. He had been dead for more than 5 hours. My father had received the call after his friend had died. It was only then my father realized that the white sheet he had requested was to cover his body, as that's what we do in our region. We call it kafan. Perhaps that's the exact reason he requested it, and my father couldn't sleep for weeks and hated to talk about the incident. When I was a sophomore in high school, I had a boyfriend who was 2 years ahead of me. He was all set up to go to boot camp for the Marine Corps when he graduated. We definitely were in puppy love, and he was my first serious boyfriend. The time came and he graduated. He was going to spend the summer with his father in California, and I was going to go spend my summer with mine in Pennsylvania. At the end of summer, he was set to ship out to basic training in San Diego. Over the summer we would talk, but we had a fight and ended up breaking up. I can't even remember what it was about. We stopped talking for a while. He went to basic, then went to infantry training, and then was deployed to Iraq. He was there for a few months and he emailed me. I returned the email and we talked a few times a week. One of the conversations we had was about us breaking up, and we ended up arguing about it. After that, I stopped getting emails from him. I thought he was just mad at me. Then came along my senior year, and I was doing a project for my American government class on the war in Iraq. I came across the casualty page and saw his picture. It was towards the top because his name started with A. I was shocked, and I lost it. I saw that he died the day after our last conversation. I couldn't believe that no one got in touch with me to tell me. I reached out to his mum, and she told me he got rid of anything and everything that reminded him of me. He threw away papers with my number on it, and she said she tried to find me but couldn't. I personally think if she'd have tried harder, she could have, but then again she was a grieving mother who had just lost her son, and it was likely the last thing on her mind. I asked her how he died, and she told me that he was the gunner on top of the Humvee, and while on patrol a group of insurgents tried to ram them off the road. The driver of the Humvee swerved and flipped it and landed on my ex. Fast forward a few months of grieving, drinking and drug use. One night I was home with my mum. Me and her got into an argument, and I called my friend Tori to come and get me so that I could stay with her the night. She told me she was out to dinner with her parents but would call me as soon as she was done. I left my phone on the charger upstairs because the battery was quickly dying. I came back downstairs and talked things out with my mum, and we ended up just watching a movie. I went upstairs after the movie and had 5 missed calls from Tori. I called her back and she said, "Hey, is Rob with you?" I told her no, that it was just me and my mum. My stepdad was at work. She said, "Someone answered your phone." I told her that was impossible, as my phone was upstairs and it was just my mum and I. She freaked out and yelled, "Oh my god, I talked to a dead guy." I asked her what he said. She said he answered the phone, and when she asked if I was there, he said I was busy at the moment. So she asked if he could leave the message, and he just said, "Fine and dandy," and that instantly gave me chills, because that's a phrase that my ex used to use a lot. I asked her if she was sure she had called my phone, and she looked at the phone record and it proved that it had. I hung up the phone and checked through my calls, and sure enough there was a recent call on my phone that lasted 23 seconds. To this day I can't explain it. After that happened, there were a few times that the thermostat outside my room would be turned all the way down without anyone touching it, and my house was a newer home. Any explanations are welcome. I work for a company that answers phones and takes messages for businesses when they're closed. We answer for a variety of companies in different fields, including funeral homes. This situation has happened twice that I have talked to the person myself on the phone, and a few other times as well. I think it's very interesting and would maybe warrant a discussion here. The first time this happened, I took the message from a lady whose mother had passed away recently. The body was already picked up and dressed at the funeral parlor, and visitation was scheduled for the following day. She calls and is weepy and asks if her mother's phone is still in her jacket pocket, because they just got a call from her number. I end up dispatching the call, as in calling the director to deliver the message verbally, and he says that he'll call her, but the body is in the casket and the casket is closed. Waiting in the parlor, I say, "Wow, weird," and he kind of chuckles and tells me that that kind of thing happens more often than I would think. It's been a year since that call, and yesterday I got another call similar for another funeral home, and other people I work with have had the same type of stories. I just wanted to get some outside opinions, because it's creepy and interesting at the same time. When I was about 16, my friend stayed the night at my house. At the time I was really into the paranormal and had just learned about EVP. That night we had watched Mothman Prophecies before going to sleep. I remember it was storming outside and there was thunder and lightning. Before going to sleep, I had set up a microphone on my PC to record sounds because my house had some weird things happen in the past, and watching that movie pumped me to make an EVP that night. I started the recording and tested the mic. I could see spikes on the track when we talked, and specifically remembered seeing a huge spike when some thunder rattled the house. The next morning I stopped the recording and noticed that there were only 4 hours of audio, but we'd been asleep for nearly 8. I began listening to the audio and it seemed normal at first. I could hear the conversation we had right after starting the recording, but no longer saw the big spike from the thunder which I initially dismissed. Upon further inspection, I see a spike on the track about 2 hours in, which would have been around 3 AM. I moved to that section of the track and hit play. In the recording I could hear what was obviously my cell phone ringing, but only partial sections of the ringtone. It ran 3 to 4 times, and then I heard an unfamiliar voice say, "Hello," in a hushed tone. I immediately grabbed my phone and checked the recent calls, and the last call I received was earlier the previous day when a friend called me to ask to hang out. No incoming or outgoing since. My brain exploded. I immediately called my friend's phone to see if his ringtone was the same, and it wasn't. He woke up looking confused about getting a call from across the room, and when I explained what I found and played the audio, he was clearly shaken up a bit and shed away from paranormal conversations I tried to initiate from then on. In addition to the weird phone call and missing thunder, throughout the recording were short sections of audio with a really quiet but obvious train horn. This wouldn't have been weird because my house is very near a busy railway. However, this was more like an old school train whistle than a modern horn, which I'd never heard in my entire time living there. Later that day, when I heard a train go by, I tried to record the sound with the same gear, thinking the sound was somehow distorted. But what I found was that the horn was barely audible. This was strange, because the train whistle in the EVP was loud enough to make a visible spike on the recording track. What do you think? My family decided to drive and stay in Mexico for a week. We're originally from Canada, but rented a car from Las Vegas. My brother picked up a SIM card for use in Mexico. Nearly right after we started using it, we got a text message from a random number. The bottom of the message said, "Love Oma and Opa," German words for grandma and grandpa, which we called my grandparents. The message talked about how much they loved and missed us and hoped the trip was going well. I would like to think that it was a loving message from beyond, but the rational side of me says it was just a very spooky coincidence. First and foremost, I am a skeptic, so I'm not going to over-dramatize this. My great-grandmother always said throughout her life that if there was something after death, she would give me a sign. She died alone in a nursing home, and after a very long day, we all returned to her family home with her husband, my great-grandfather. We stayed with him that night so that he wasn't alone. Long story short, we all went to bed around midnight. Not long after that, the phone starts ringing. There's no one on the other end. This happened a few times. In the UK, you can dial 1471 to trace the call, but it was untraceable. This happened a few times before it ended. This, as a skeptic, was the first time I'd considered something to be unexplainable. It brought me great comfort, so paranormal or not, I'd like to think it was my great-grandma saying this is the only sign I could send, and I'm okay. My father stayed at his friend's house one night because of work. The next morning he wanted to check on us, and he dialed our telephone number. Some guy picked up, and he said things like, "Shame on you. How could you stay at someone else's house knowing that you and your wife and daughters are home alone? Have you lost your mind? Stop being so stupid and come home." The guy didn't stop the beration, and my father didn't understand what just happened. He asked for his name, but then the phone got cut. My father thought it could be one of his family members visiting our home. That's the only thing he could rationally think of. So he called the lady living on the second floor to check on us as we lived on the third. As she climbed the stairs to see there was no one home, and the house was locked. My mother and I were at my sister's school paying her fees, and at the time no one was home. Even if we assume my father had called a different number, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, he knew my father's name, he knew he had 2 daughters, and he knew our family. Still, at this date, we don't know who the guy was. My father says it was his big brother. He was the only one who would scold him like that, and he had died 3 to 4 months before the telephone incident. We still get chills when we reflect on this story. My father's mother died back in 1999. She had congestive heart failure for a number of years, and one day her heart gave out, so she didn't suffer. The night she died, I went over to the local hospital to see her, and didn't get a chance to say goodbye. A few days later we had her funeral, buried her, and went about our normal routine. 3 days after she died, I went to town for some reason and came back home and noticed that my landline answering machine was on, and it was flashing and said that I had a message. I played it, and it was her voice saying goodbye. I was at work one day about a year after my brother had passed away. My phone rang and there was a man on the other end sounding bewildered. It was as if he thought maybe he had called the wrong number. After my perky greeting of, "Thank you for calling, this is, how may I help you?" the man hesitated. "I'm trying to find my sister." I said that he had reached a place of business and that he might have called the wrong number. I disconnected the call and told my colleague about it right away because it was odd, and the caller did sound like my deceased brother. He called again. "I'm trying to find my sister. I'm supposed to bring someone to her." This time the call dropped on his end. Well, of note, the location of my office was kind of a hotspot for the paranormal. The colleague I mentioned, called Liz, had a desk to my left. Behind us, a mere 5 feet away, our manager had a tiny cubicle with a partition. Our manager was on vacation, and another manager was filling in for her, Sissy. She had a very distinct accent, and Liz and I were working when we heard Sissy say from behind the partition, "Hey Liz, come and see this as soon as you can." Liz stood up and stepped behind the partition. There was no one there at all, and within a moment Liz received a phone call that her father lay dying in Jamaica. We were in California, and he wanted Liz to come see me as soon as you can. The creepiest thing I've ever experienced happened nearly 14 years ago. I remember it was quite a cold afternoon, and considering I was getting ready for the gym, it probably was around 5:30 p.m. I was putting my gym towel in the backpack along with a water bottle and some gloves. Before leaving the house, I went to the bathroom and locked the door. I should have mentioned I was alone in my house. My mum had left the house about an hour earlier to visit the grocery store. While I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom, I heard the phone ring. I wasn't able to answer, so I just didn't care at that moment. It kept ringing for at least a full minute until I heard someone lift the phone receiver. At first, I tried thinking rationally, and I convinced myself that the noise I heard wasn't the receiver being lifted. A few seconds later, as I was about to get out of the bathroom, I heard someone putting the receiver back on the phone. I immediately froze and realized that someone was in the house. Without thinking rationally anymore, I quickly got out of the bathroom and started looking around the house. While being in my parents' bedroom, the phone started ringing again. This time I quickly rushed to answer, but the ringing stopped right before I arrived in the hallway where the phone is. I heard the receiver being lifted again, and then I got the worst feeling I've ever experienced in my life. I heard footsteps coming from the hallway towards me, and seriously thought I was going to be killed or kidnapped. I froze for a few seconds that felt like hours, until the footsteps stopped. I peeked around the corner, and there was no one in the hallway. I sat down on the floor for a few minutes until I finally decided to take a look around the house again. I didn't find anyone or anything strange. I wanted to leave the house badly, but just before leaving I wanted to check who called on the phone. Turns out the last received call was in the morning. It was like the 2 calls I received never happened. By then I was seriously creeped out. I took my keys and went to the gym. When I returned, my mum was back home and I decided not to tell her anything about the footsteps and the phone calls. Just as I dropped my backpack on the floor, my mum greeted me and said, "I think there's something wrong with my cell phone. I received 2 calls while I was shopping and couldn't even answer them. Can't even find the call history." I told her I had no idea and spent the rest of the day insanely creeped out. I even turned off my cell phone and plugged out of the phone before going to sleep. To this day, I still have no explanation. When I was 12, my grandmother passed away, and I really loved her, as she practically raised me since I was very young, as my parents were divorced and mother had to work. It was around 1999. I was living in the same house with my mum and sister, and we used to hang around the main room watching movies, and most of the time fell asleep on Sundays. One day while we were sleeping, the phone rings and I pick up. The call was very noisy and there was a woman on the other side, and they called me by name and she said, "Open the window." I asked, "Who is this?" "Open the window," she replied. "Why? Who is this?" "I'm your grandma, now open the window," and then hung up. After that, and still startled, thinking it must have been a wrong number, I began walking back to my room and walked past the kitchen and suddenly felt the smell of gas leaking. I hurried to open the windows and then woke my mum up and told her. She said it was the first time she saw me truly scared. I still don't know what happened. It might have been a wrong number, but the chances of what happening were just insanely slim. My mum passed away on the 16th of May, and my dad was making arrangements, and he lost his phone in the funeral home. Just as he realized this, we heard it ringing, and it was my mum's number on the ID. He didn't reach it fast enough to answer, and no one left a message, but my mum was always worried about him losing his phone and her not being able to reach him. We both think it was her trying to help. Her phone was back at the house, locked up inside, and wasn't with charge before we left to follow her body to the funeral home. I had looked at it, trying to find some numbers for family that my dad didn't have, but couldn't even get it plugged in before we left to start the process of planning the funeral. This must have been nearly 15 years ago now. My brother would get a call on his cell phone at around 2 to 3 a.m. every night. He would answer, and it would be this hellish sounding noise, like static mixed with screams. He changed his cell number after months of this, and it stopped. Then after a week or so it began again, the exact same noise at the exact same time. Finally one day, he decided to backdial the call. It was an old man that had no clue what he was talking about, and still the calls persisted. If he didn't answer, it would call a few more times and no messages were ever left. He decided to say screw it, ended his contract with the phone company and switched to a new one, and then got a new number. You guessed it, the screaming static calls continued after a short delay. By this time he was terrified every night, unsure why this was happening. He backdialed the number again and got a different person. Around this time he lost his job and his phone. The call stopped, of course. His phone was disconnected now, so one day my mum asks me to listen to this weird message she got on our home phone. It was the static screaming. We showed my brother and he was freaking out. He backdialed the number again, and it said the number was disconnected this time. Never heard from it again after that. Around the time I was 19, I was deployed to Iraq. My unit worked with bombs, and honestly I didn't know if I was going to make it home intact. About halfway through my tour, the Red Cross notified my unit that my father was terminally ill. Within a week I was on a plane back to the States. Now my dad being ill was something I had got used to. He was strong though, and I never expected him to actually lose it. I lost my mother when I was 7, and my father's lung had collapsed shortly before then. He was on oxygen and needed a wheelchair to go anywhere. Medication by the handfuls were needed every few hours. He gained weight from limited movement, developed diabetes, and had already beaten cancer once. I never expected him to lose. He wasn't the type to ever give up. I arrive home, head to the hospital, and he assures me he's fine and that they're overreacting. I visit him every day I'm there, but he tells me he'll be fine by the time I get home for good. I reluctantly go back overseas. I call his hospital whenever I have a few minutes of free time and we're near a call center. My deployment finishes and he kept his promise. He comes home from the hospital because he says he doesn't want to die there. He gets worse and goes back. The family all visit, but we know he isn't improving. One day I'm home and the phone rings. It's an unknown number, so I don't answer. It goes to the answering machine and a very raspy voice mumbles, "Call the hospital." It's my dad. I grab my phone, but he's already hung up. So I call, and they tell me he's been intubated for the past few hours, and he's starting to go into cardiac arrest. He's non-responsive, and we might need to come and say our goodbyes. I argue that he just called me, and she says that's not possible. They've been working on him for some time now. I hung up and told my family the news. My sister and I stared at the answering machine, and we played the tape again and again. That was the last time I heard my father's voice. I'm a skeptic. I don't believe in ghosts or the paranormal, but I cannot come up with any logical explanation, and still get teary when I think about it. This happened to me in 2013, in the ancient times when people still had landline phones in their house. I work in insurance, investigating and inspecting people's property claims and conducting site visits in the field. I typically call people about a half hour before arriving for appointments just to make sure they remembered the appointment and will be home. This one particular claim I had was in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, which is about an hour north of Pittsburgh. I call the homeowner's home phone and let them know that I'm on my way, and a very old-sounding woman answers the phone. We have a very poor connection with a lot of static, and she keeps saying stuff like, "Hello? Can you hear me, dear? Hello?" I tell her I'm going to hang up and call back. I hang up, call back immediately, but no one answers now. I then call the cell number and get a much younger-sounding woman on the phone who tells me she's leaving the school where she just dropped her kids off and would be there in a few minutes. I arrive to the house thinking someone else is home and ring the doorbell around the same time the homeowner pulls up into the driveway. When the homeowner arrives, she's a young woman in her late 20s and sounds absolutely nothing like the person who answered the phone. I comment that I called the house phone, but whoever answered couldn't hear me and said something like, "Oh, I'm sorry if I woke up your mum or grandma or whatever." She looked confused and said I must have called the wrong number because no one was home. Wanting to make sure we have the right information for her, I read back the number I called and she confirms that it's her home phone number. She asks me what the lady sounded like, and I told her it sounded like an old woman on the phone. She turns pale and looks very scared, and tells me I'm freaking her out because her family recently moved in, and she swears she thought the house that they have is haunted by an old woman. So at this point the homeowner is very agitated about what happened, so I try to make sense of it and ask her if she thinks she could call the police in the event someone had broken into our home and answered the phone for her. I walk around the home checking the doors and windows, and the house seems secure. We entered and she goes directly to her phone/answering machine. Her phone has caller ID, and sure enough, both of the calls from my number are on it. The first time I called shows the call was answered, and the second shows a missed call. So at this point she's really freaking out because caller ID shows that someone answered the phone. Again I ask her if she thinks we should call the police, thinking there might actually be an intruder in the home who was nice enough to answer, but she declines and tells me about how she's been telling her husband she thinks the house is haunted and how he's been making fun of her for it, and she's glad someone else experienced something but is totally scared to death by it. The homeowner proceeds to tell me how strange things similar to this have been happening at the house, with a lot of activity taking place in the attic. Turns out the attic is exactly where I have to inspect the damage. She refused to go up to the attic with me and just pointed me in the direction and stood at the bottom of the steps, nervously clutching a flashlight and her cell phone. I was pretty freaked out myself at this point, expecting either an intruder to jump at me or see a ghost. I got out of there pretty quickly. Years later, I can still remember exactly what the old lady sounded like. I've tried rationalizing it, thinking it must have been the numbers got crossed or whatever, but the caller ID showed 2 calls from me. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I do hope that you enjoyed tonight's collection of scary stories. If of course you did, you can let me know down below. It certainly means an awful lot. I'd like to give a huge thank you as always to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. If you enjoyed these kind of stories and would like extra bonus content, you could follow the link in the description to find out more. You get your name at the end of the screen, and a whole bunch of exclusive stories and extra perks. If you sign up, you can actually listen to a few hospice and terminal patient horror stories. It's a short one, but it was published yesterday. That's it from me. Hopefully, see you in the next one. Stay awesome, and good night.